Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with Chris Hughes, economist, entrepreneur, and a co-founder of Facebook, about his new book, Market Crafters, The 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. And you can learn more at Market Crafters Book. Market Crafters Book, all one word.com. This conversation was recorded Wednesday, June 25th, and not long before recording, Chris learned that he could not be with us for the full hour, that he was going to have to go after about 45 minutes. Due to time being tight and events unpredictable, I did not write something new for you for the last 15 minutes. Instead, I'm going to read a speech I gave June 9th, 1989, 36 years ago, at my 20th college reunion. Harvard class of 1969. Ours was the class, the year of the building takeover and the strike. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. And I'm going to be speaking today with Chris Hughes, economist, entrepreneur, and a co-founder of Facebook, about his new book, Market Crafters, The 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. And you can learn more at Market Crafters Book. Market Crafters Book, all one word.com. This conversation was recorded Wednesday, June 25th, and not long before recording, Chris learned that he could not be with us for the full hour, that he was going to have to go after about 45 minutes. Due to time being tight and events unpredictable, I did not write something new for you for the last 15 minutes. Instead, I'm going to read a speech I gave June 9th, 1989, 36 years ago, at my 20th college reunion. Harvard class of 1969. Ours was the class, the year of the building takeover and the strike. Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm going to be speaking today with Chris Hughes, an economist, an entrepreneur, one of the co-founders of Facebook, about his new book, Market Crafters, The 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. And you can learn more at Market Crafters, all one word, Market Crafters Book. Actually, that's all one word, marketcraftersbook.com, or at his nonprofit, which is the Economic Security Project.org. Okay, on Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available, of course, anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, all one word, .net. As a co-founder of Facebook, who left the company in 2007 and called for the breakup of Facebook, or Meta, in 2019, Chris Hughes has a fairly unique perspective on our relationships with technology, screens, data. And I'm going to ask him a few questions at the top to tap that perspective. And then we're going to spend the rest of our conversation talking about the people and the ideas in his new book, Market Crafters. And I'm telling Chris this for the first time right now, but I'm going to ask Chris to introduce the premise of the book. And I'll say briefly, it's a kind of a hidden history of what he calls government market crafting, to reveal how it works, examine when and why it succeeds and fails, to learn our lessons. And then the real goal, I think, is to prepare us to use market crafting effectively to recover from the Trump years as soon as we get the chance. And he does this by telling 12 stories. But these aren't simply 12 stories of government actions or interventions. He tells those stories through the personal stories of 12 individuals who found themselves in the middle of those actions and those interventions. So the power of personal history and narrative is definitely at play in what you might think, was going to be dry stuff, but he brings a lot of humanity to it, and I think makes it much more interesting that way. And I want us to build most of our conversation around his telling a few of those stories. And Ira Glass tells us that every This American Life story has a certain format. And if you go back and listen, you'll see it's really true. It's then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. This is what it means. Or then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. This is what we learned. And he basically says you've got to add that meaning or lesson every few moments as you go through, every 5 minutes maybe, as you go through a long anecdote to make it really have the impact you want it to have and to make it stick. And so I'm going to invite Chris to, as he's telling these stories of these individuals and their role in these interventions, to pull the lessons and the meanings that he did. And I will also break in now and then to ask questions. Okay. Chris Hughes co-founded Facebook as a student at Harvard and later led Barack Obama's digital organizing campaign for president in 2008. He's co-founder and chair of the Economic Security Project, a nonprofit that advocates for economic power for all Americans. His writing has been published in the New York Times, Time, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. He's the author of Fair Shot, Rethinking Inequality and How We Earn. And his latest, the one we're talking about today, Market Crafters, the 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. Welcome, Chris Hughes, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
Well, that was an amazing introduction. Thank you, Terrence.
Oh, you're very welcome. And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Wednesday, June 25th. These days, it's very easy for our conversations to be taken over by events. So I want to put a little stake in the ground and say, we didn't know about the thing that happened next Tuesday. And I also want to say that Chris and I recorded a previous conversation, but it wasn't on this podcast. This is his first time here. It was as a Live Talks LA event in the public on his book, Fair Shot. And I want to throw the first question, Chris, to you. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work, the ideas we talk about. So tell us briefly in your words how you see your path to the work you're doing today, and feel free to go back, mention mentors, turning points, inspirations, those sorts of things.
Well, I love economics and politics and government today, and I think a lot about why that is and where those interests came from. So I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, Hickory, North Carolina. My mom was a public school teacher, and my dad was a traveling paper salesman. And we had a, pretty middle class kind of life. I was a good student. I did well in school, and I was curious about the world and ambitious. And so I ended up leaving to go to boarding school in Massachusetts. And then I was accepted to Harvard. And it was there that while I was studying social studies, history, literature, a little bit of economics, that my life took a big turn. In my sophomore year, Mark Zuckerberg, Dustin Moskovitz, and I were roommates, and we tinkered a lot. We were interested in a lot of different projects and ideas, and one of those things was the early Facebook.com website, which exploded in size and scope after we started it in February of 2004. And then for the next 3 years, I did a lot of different things. I was at once the spokesperson for the company doing communications work. I ended up doing some work with public policy and politicians. I was what we call a product developer. What do you actually see on the website? What do you do? And I did that for a little over 3 years. I enjoyed it, but didn't feel it was my life's work. It wasn't a mission in the same way it was for Mark. And I ended up leaving, as you were saying in the introduction, to go work for Barack Obama and work in digital organizing. I won't take you through every moment of my career, but I think the upshot of what I'm trying to say is my life was profoundly transformed by the financial success that came with Facebook's commercial success. I made more money than I could have ever imagined. And I was still that kid who grew up in a middle class family in North Carolina on the inside. And
How old? Just a
it
quick question, Chris. How old were you in 2007 when you left with that more money than you could have ever imagined?
Well, the money, I was 24 when I left, but the money didn't come until Facebook IPO'd, and that I
Oh,
was 29 then,
okay. So 24,
2012.
29. Go ahead. Thanks.
Yeah, 28, 29. And uh, that whole journey made me increasingly interested in political economy. How come we have some people who have these blockbuster wins and so many others who don't? Why is the cost of housing and healthcare so high when it shouldn't be? How can we still have poverty in the United States when we're the richest country in the world with hundreds of billionaires? I mean, these kinds of like big political questions, big economic questions. So I started working in economics a little bit about 10 years ago, and first as an activist, and then I turned towards research and academia. And so now I'm completing a PhD at Wharton. I've written this book that I'm very proud of, and I spend all the time that I'm not with my kids or my husband thinking about economics and government and how we can use the tools that we have to create a more prosperous and fair country.
This idea of going back and getting your PhD. Um, just tell me a little bit about that decision, because the motivations for some people, I would think, might be that they could use it to make a fortune or use it so that they could
No,
write
no.
books on economics. You've done both of those things.
No. Yeah, no, it wasn't about either of those things for me. So, I around 20, I guess, right about the time that I had my first child, I had spent a few years working in economics, and I had a lot of every time I learned something in economics, I had more questions, particularly because the economics field often wants to tell you that there's a math, a science, that there's truth with a capital T about how markets work. I was a little suspicious of that as an idea of any quote unquote natural law. Where does this come from? And is it really natural? And how does it change over the course of history? So, and I wanted a structured environment to do that learning. So I first started
Ah,
and got my master's in economics here in New York at the New School for Social Research. And I loved the learning process. And um, that really lit a fire. And so then I decided after I got the master's that I wanted to do the PhD. And that's offered me the opportunity to go very deep on a lot of very technical questions, but to do that with a fantastic advisor and a community of other scholars who are interested in similar topics that I am. And that helps sort of not just point my course of study, but also reinforce a lot of the values of scholarly inquiry. And
yeah, yeah. No, what I can imagine is
I learn more. I learn more from the experts, to be honest, and I get the chance to spend the time with it.
that's what I was thinking, is that it isn't just head down looking at that paper and that paper and all that peer reviewed
Right.
good stuff. It's the community you're in.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I tell you, I've toyed with it myself a couple of times, of going back and getting
It's never
an advanced
never
degree.
too late, Terrence.
There you
Never
go.
too late.
Okay, so as I said, we're going to start with a few things. What are you thinking these days? I wrote this down as like the broad ass question. What are you thinking these days about tech? What, if anything, do you see as good news? What should we be most concerned about? What are you most concerned about?
There's so many problems that I'm just sitting here shaking my head,
Yeah.
thinking about where to start. Um, Maybe I should try to start on a hopeful note. I think that there are real frontier breaking technologies that often create a sense of awe in me, at least, and I think in others, particularly the AI and what we call the LLM models, not just from OpenAI, but also from Anthropic's Claude, Google's Gemini, et cetera. I think these are really path-breaking technologies which have the potential, and I put a big underline under that word, potential,
We've seen
to
that
really
before.
positively, exactly, really positively shape our lives, our economy, and our world if we steer them in the right direction. Okay, so I'm trying to start hopeful. the number of problems that come, not just with Meta, but with so many of the tech companies. Um, I think as a parent, I worry. I have deep concerns about the use of social media and screen time on the mental health of children, of my children, and children across the country. I think we have not solved many of the privacy needs that people feel. They often feel like their data is harvested and exploited with relatively little control over it. Misinformation abounds. Every time there's an event in the news, you know that everybody's going to get their own customized version of it, often in a way that's packaged to please them, not to tell the truth.
Or if I'm right, or to irritate them, so that
Fair
the
enough.
algorithm
Yes,
goes for anything
absolutely.
that'll boost
Yes,
your
yes, yes,
neurotransmitters,
to
right?
boost. Yes, to boost rage, absolutely. And none of that is to say, is to discuss the problems of corporate concentration and how the power of some of the biggest companies, not just in technology, but in our country across the globe, is really remains outsized. These companies have minted these centibillionaires, and there are many of them. And there's nothing wrong with economic success. I've had it, and many other people have. But there is something I think suspicious about an economy in a country that creates hundreds and hundreds of billionaires and still has millions of people living in poverty. Something there is broken.
Yeah.
And so I think that is, more of a broader problem, and not just this problem specific to tech, but the corporate concentration leads to outsized power for many of those voices. So I think we should all be profoundly concerned about it.
Very good, very good. Let me just remind people, just it's one sentence, but it's worth remembering. If the service is free, you're the product. So anything that you
Yeah.
do online that's free, it's because the data you're supplying them is what really is driving their economic model.
Well, and the attention that you're providing. So even if the data isn't harvested, nonetheless, the capturing your attention can be very valuable.
Right. Okay. Briefly, you, as I mentioned, back in 2019, in an op-ed in the New York Times, advocated for the breakup of Facebook/Meta. That is actually now being contested. Mark Zuckerberg has testified. What has happened, and what's the status of that? It's one of those things that would be big news in another era.
Yeah. Well, just to so I wrote that piece in 2019, and the Federal Trade Commission and many states attorneys general were all investigating some of the decisions that then Facebook, later Meta, had made. And a year later, the FTC of the first Trump administration filed suit against Meta, claiming that it had illegally snuffed out competition by acquiring WhatsApp and Instagram, and then effectively underfunding them, not supporting them as competitive, in a way of neutralizing competition rather than improving services for customers. So that case, even though it was filed 5 years ago, took a long and winding road. It was initially dismissed. Lena Khan's FTC reformulated it, strengthened the case significantly, refiled it, and then, as you said, it just went to trial this spring. A couple months ago, Mark Zuckerberg and others were on the stand, and both sides have now concluded in the courtroom, and the judge is considering the evidence. So,
Wow.
I don't have any crystal ball. I don't know where that case will go, but I think what's important is that it's part of a family of cases against some of the other tech giants, some of which have resolved and have been won by the government, and some of which have not. So Google has been declared a monopoly not once, but twice
In
in
the
the past
US.
year in the United States.
Because I'm going to ask you afterwards to tell us where Europe is, but even in the U.S., Google's been
First
called a
on
monopoly
the
twice.
first on Yes, first on its search monopoly, illegally cornering that market by using its profits, the rents that it's secured to shut down other entrants and competition, and then later in the online advertising market. And then, of course, there's a case against Amazon. We could go through all the cases, but the upshot of all of this is that there's actually bipartisan interest in a reinvigorated antitrust that says, we want free, competitive markets in the United States. We just want them to be structured in a way so that they're open and fair, so that the best company can win. Instead of having markets where a single company uses its market power to grow so large that it effectively shuts down competition, hurting innovation. And I think one of the takeaways that I've asked a couple people in the past few months is, for those folks who use Instagram today and who use WhatsApp today, different are those products from when you started using them 10 years ago? Instagram has stories, which is a meaningful change. That was a Snapchat idea that was, effectively lifted, if not stolen. So that's a meaningful change. Outside of that, how different are those? Those products have not meaningfully evolved. They have been effectively frozen. And I think that, when people ask, well, what is the problem here? Why do we need competitive markets? It's because when you don't have competition, not only do you get a few very, very, very wealthy individuals, but you also get a market where the products just sort of become more static, if not even atrophy. And that's, we're going to have a kind of structured capitalism like we do. The whole point of the competition is to engender productivity gains and innovation. And that competitive energy has fizzled in a lot of these markets.
Very good. And it seems to me, I want to hear also just a little hint of where Europe is ahead of us in this.
The Europeans have passed several pioneering pieces of regulation. Some pieces of it are good. Some I think I would quibble with. They have a regulatory regime for artificial intelligence, which will go into effect over the coming years. They passed something called the Digital Markets Act, which has come into full force this spring. They're already applying pressure on Apple and Meta, potentially impacting some of their revenues and potentially Google. And so they are bringing certainly their own oversight to bear, but I wouldn't say that theirs is there's a lot happening in the United States at the same time. So this is one of those moments where there seems to be a global set of concerns about reining in some of the power of the most powerful companies in tech, and there are differences in the way that different
and one thing I was thinking as you were describing the situation and the problems we face is I couldn't help but see in my mind's eye Trump's inauguration and the billionaires lined up behind him.
Yeah, but that is also, when I saw that, I thought, wow, this is going to be the image that haunts him. But I also think there are competing strands in the Republican Party. And there is this strand that is about providing access to some of the wealthiest men in the country, as we saw with Elon Musk, and also the inauguration. There's also a strand of desiring antitrust reinvigoration,
which is interesting.
Not only it is the Trump, it's Trump's FTC that is in court every day prosecuting Meta, and Mark Zuckerberg went to the White House several times to try to settle that case, and it didn't work yet. You never know, but it didn't. I mean, even the FTC filed suit against Uber 2 months ago. So,
and that's Trump's administration doing that.
Yes, exactly. And the case against Amazon and other things continues too. So,
by the way,
it's not to deny that there's all kinds of corporate influence in this White House. Okay, that is also true, but it's this is a kind of transitional time. I think I'd say.
I was going to say actually, the competing strands actually reinforces why they would be at the inauguration. If you follow me, that they know that it's not a slam dunk yet. Okay. I will I have questions about fair shot and guaranteed income and that sort of thing, but I'm going to pass on those and just refer people to Chris's book, Fair Shot. He does a deep dive into ways to I think you don't call it guaranteed basic income because you sort of means test it a
I
little
call
and
it
so on.
guaranteed. I call it guaranteed income, not the, it's a very different idea than the universal
Yeah,
basic income, which I don't
right,
support.
right. But if that's an idea that interests you, uh, Chris has written about it. You can find articles about it, and the book for a shot goes into it deeply. Okay, so let's switch to this book. Um, how did it happen? What did you set out to do?
So, it's useful that we've been talking a lot about tech and these different markets because my own journey on economic policy led me to believe that we really do need structured, open, fair markets for capitalism to be more fair and for it to work in a way that helps everyone and not just the investor class. And so for me, I began work on Market Crafter several years ago, thinking that I was writing a history of the Fed. I've become very interested in the history of central banking. That's what my dissertation is on. It's a very powerful and important institution. But while I was, sketching out what that book I thought was going to become, there was this explosion of interest in industrial policy in the United States. It happened initially in the first Trump administration, again, some around semiconductors, but then of course, we had the pandemic, we had all kinds of shortages, and the Biden administration began to look more seriously at how government policy could help support the development of certain industries that were important to the common good. And eventually, the Biden folks passed a major climate bill full of public investment and market crafting policies. It passed the Chips and Semiconductor Act, which brought the semiconductor back in. So, what I wanted to do in this book is to take all of that contemporary interest and to zoom out and say, okay, what is the story of policymakers crafting and shaping markets in the United States? I had seen in my own research that this was a recurring phenomenon in American history, so that happens so frequently that it sort of burst the bubble of the free market mythology for me. This idea that markets in the United States are mostly self-regulating, we leave the decisions to the private sector. That's not really what I see in the history. If you look at lots of industries that I think most people would agree are structured, they're very large. So you think financial markets and services, healthcare, aviation, pharmaceuticals,
Agriculture to some
cars and
extent.
automobiles. To some extent, agriculture. What you see time and time again is that that policymakers say, wait a second, we want everyone to have health care, and yet we are going to have private companies try to provide that health care, and we're going to sort of point them towards this public goal. Now, healthcare is one where we do not do it well at all. But then in other cases, like in financial markets, the Federal Reserve sets the price of short-term credit, manages price stability. We had this inflationary flare-up, which was, by the accounts of most, more related to supply chains than it was to the Fed. But by and large, the Fed keeps our financial system stable. It's not perfect, but it is successful. So I look at that with semiconductors and a few other things. So the point of the book is to reconceive of how Americans not just think about how markets work, but how government can actually, when it is smart, be a force for good in these markets to ensure that more people have access, that goods are more affordable, and that we can fight some of the crises that are on the horizon, including climate change.
Yeah, no, it was interesting. I watched your interview with Jon Stewart in The Daily Show, and
Yeah,
no, it was
it's a fun one.
yeah, he took longer than he usually does. He usually makes those about 10, and yours was closer to 20. But I remember him saying, "We all are told the government doesn't pick winners or losers," and he says we're especially told that when they're considering helping the people rather than the corporations. And I was going to say, just sort of, you even call your book, I think, a hidden history, because as you've said, we have a sort of public facing thing of this is the way we operate, and you look behind the curtain and there's other stuff going on.
Yeah.
Um, and is that your sense as well, kind of, that um,
Well,
where we lag is in what you called the good, where it expands the common good rather than a particular industry?
Well, I wanted to write a book that would be, first off, full of characters and stories. The way that I tend to remember things in the long term is to have these sticky stories, people that I can connect with sometimes complex concepts. But then of those people, I wanted some of them to be names that a lot of your listeners would know about, people like Alan Greenspan or Lena Khan. And then I wanted a lot of those people to be folks that you don't know about. And so it's not so much as they've been, you know, purposefully
Right,
hidden
right.
in the archives. It's just that, people, they have been often overlooked or quickly forgotten, even though they've had significant impacts. So, just as an example, I start the book with this guy, Jesse Jones,
Yeah,
who
let me just cut in for one
ran,
second, Chris, and say this
please,
is
yeah,
where you can shift to give me some Jesse Jones, maybe give me some Bill Simon, some Lena Khan, and
sure,
and I'll
sure.
let you rip for about as long as we've got left, and I'll just break in when I need to.
That sounds great. So I started the book with this large in life character, Jesse Jones, who ran a national investment bank in the United States, helped rescue the financial sector in the depths of the Depression, jumpstart the housing industry a few years later, and then really use the private sector to help win the war, the Second World War, by meaningfully investing in national security, everything from planes to rubber to pipelines. And so this guy, was a Texan millionaire who he's an entrepreneur. He made a lot of money in lumber yards and then later in real estate. He was connected to politics. The Depression happens in 1929, and he doesn't have a lot going on business wise. And he turns to Washington first as a board member, and then later in the Roosevelt administration as the leader of the RFC. And so this story is an important one because we tend to think about these. Whether they're a recession or a depression, the idea is that there's some kind of like natural business cycle,
Oh, right.
and that the only way to get out of it is to, weather the storm and then, wait for the private sector to invest again and to start hiring. And even Jesse Jones himself might have said that in the beginning of his tenure at the RFC.
Yeah.
But what we see in the history is the fact that the National Investment Bank was able to step in and say to all the commercial banks, the private sector banks, that it was there to help them recapitalize their balance sheets and begin to lend again. At first, it was just about saving them from not going bankrupt and
Right,
then pushing them to lend again. When they were a little slow at that, the RFC starts doing lending directly. When they want to give still more juice to it, they say, hey, housing is going to be the biggest industry that we can support. There's all kinds of folks who work in that industry, and we need no one's been building. We need more shelter. And so they create Fannie Mae and the whole mortgage, the 30-year mortgage and that whole market. And then in the war, as I was saying, they make these really massive investments to turn private sector interest towards public sector goals. This is market craft. This is very successful market craft. and it goes on for a couple decades. It eventually sunsets in the early 1950s, which is as a result of the of Jesse Jones' own inability to create an institution that will outlast him, unlike the Federal Reserve or the FTC or some of these other things. The RFC had become so tied up with his identity that once he left the building, it fizzled, and it fell prey to shift in the political dynamics of the time. But nonetheless, we can learn a lot from that
Yeah.
lesson, because a
And
national investment bank today would help us combat climate change, develop critical minerals, and potentially invest in industries that provide a lot more jobs.
well,
So
and
it
I
could
would
be a
think
real
housing,
win-win-win.
housing. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah, and I had never heard of him. You know,
Yeah.
Ida Tarbell, Francis Perkins, David Icke. I think those were the people that I had, whose names remember
Harold
from.
Ickes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Harold Ickes, from history in high school or whatever. But Jesse Jones, not a word. Okay, just to go with a
Yeah.
completely very different idea, Bill Simon, who
Mm,
is interesting to me because he would have sworn he wasn't going to do what he did, and then circumstances demanded that he do.
yeah. So I'm a little obsessed with the 1970s. I think they were such a fulcrum moment in American economic and political history, and we have so much to learn from that. I mean, just think about, there was um, two dramatic Middle East confrontations and wars, first in 1973, then later with the Iranian Revolution, 1979. We got that going on right now. You had spikes in prices. Inflation was out of control really twice in the decade. We just went through a period that felt a lot like that to a lot of us. And then you had real sort of social and cultural changes that made many people wary of government and institutions and consolidated power. And man, I think that describes, whether you're on the right or the left, that describes the mood of this moment as well. So I see so much that's similar to our time in the 70s. And Bill Simon, the reason I write about him is because he he was a very effective market crafter. He actually, in the first oil crisis, was the man who ensured that gas prices did not spike meaningfully at that moment for most Americans, that there were not home heating oil shortages, there were not long gas lines in the first crisis in the 70s. And he did that by crafting that market, by making decisions, allocative decisions about who got what, by setting up temporary price controls, by conserving uh, uh, not only the resources that the government had uh, control over, but that were distributed to the private sector. He managed the market for the better part of the year, and he was quite effective at doing it. And I contrast that in the book to what happened at the end of the decade, which was actually when Jimmy Carter was president. There was the second oil crisis, and this is what many people remember: government incompetency, because Carter said, "We're just going to let the market figure it out." He decontrolled prices at the moment. And unsurprisingly, there were all kinds of shortages. There were long gas lines. And it was yet another moment in American history where many Americans wondered if government could get anything right. And so the reason I wrote this section of the book this way is to say, yeah, we can. But when we do market crafting effectively, we have a couple of these core ingredients. Like with Jones, Simon was an entrepreneurial leader who was at the top of an institution of government that had a lot of power and the discretion to use that power as it saw fit. And then, Congress was able to hold it accountable in the long term. And so when I see effective market craft, those are the ingredients that I see: these effective state entrepreneurs, the strong institutions that are invested with power, and the discretion to get it done. And so throughout the book, I sort of trace those patterns again and again as they
and that,
emerge. And then I compare that to things like healthcare markets where we don't have any of those things.
right. And you also at another point say For a market crafting policy to be effective and progressive, it must have three features. And I expected that's what you were going to do there, but it's a different three features. It's a clear mission, and then sound implementation and robust accountability.
Yeah, when I say clear mission, I think for me that's synonymous with a strong entrepreneur at the top. Unless you know what you're doing, you're never going to be successful. And so, particularly in government, I think you have to have that clear mission. And then the structure is what I mean by the power,
And the
by
discretion.
an institution that's invested with power and discretion. Exactly.
And then accountability, obviously, and when you point out an industry like healthcare or certainly aspects of housing these days, accountability would say, we're falling very far short. I believe you've got to go very shortly. You have said that one of the purpose of this book and of all your work right now is to be ready, as I mentioned in the introduction, is to be ready to market craft the next time progressives get the chance, or the next time Trump is not in office. I'll make this your last question, but looking now, and of course events can go crazy between now and the time, what would be your sort of sense now of how to go about it? What would be the biggest priorities, that sort of thing?
Well, I think foundationally we have to say that we need an economy that works for Americans, and we got to stop talking about it in a way that Americans are working for the economy. The economy is a reflection of our social practices, of our social, cultural, financial values, and as a result, it can be managed. We can have the kind of economy that we want to have. So it's not this uncontrollable beast that, we can only just set up a safety net and help a couple people when they get fired. It's something that can be guided towards the common good. So, foundationally, I think that's a new way of talking about it, which we have to embrace. Now, more concretely, I think Americans continue to be very frustrated about the high cost of living. Even though inflation has come down, prices haven't. They're still quite high. And it's particularly on the kind of big ticket goods that we all need to live: housing, healthcare for parents, childcare, and in some cases, even basic food commodities. Eggs have come back down a bit, but you go to the grocery store, and I still often marvel, like, why am I still paying this much?
It just doesn't feel like it did before the pandemic when you go in the grocery store.
Yeah, and I'm like a guy who's got plenty of resources and should be relatively unfazed about it, but I still don't want to pay more than something's worth. So I think that we have to talk about those costs, and then we have to pair that with an agenda that can say, hey, housing costs, in the long term, in order to bring down housing costs, we're going to have to build more housing. So I'm with some of the folks in the abundance world that means streamlining and simplifying the zoning regulations. I think that makes a lot of sense to do, but it also won't be enough on its own. It's got to be paired with other proactive policies, like an industrial policy for modular housing. This is the kind of housing that's mostly constructed off-site, and then you bring it on-site, and it looks sort of like a kid's toys, where you put it together in the course of several days, not even weeks.
Right. Prefab.
And you can have exactly, you can have a house that's affordable and in some cases quite nice. I think you also need to think about something like a housing construction fund, which could create more stable and lower interest rates for housing developers, as long as they're building housing that's going to be relatively dense and affordable. Then they should be able to finance that in a stable way to make it more likely to make the math work, just to get more buildings up, get more apartments available, get more houses available, lowering the cost of housing. So I think we need to do that on housing. I think we need to have a similar plan on healthcare and childcare. I could go through many of these things. I write about them on my Substack often for folks who want to know more. But I think that the point is to say that markets need to be crafted and managed to work for us. And we can do that in a way that recognizes the critical importance of the entrepreneurial energy in the private sector. That's the world I come from. And I see that as critically important. And that says, that's great. We need to ensure that all of that entrepreneurial energy is actually creating products and services that people need, that people want, and thus and that people can access at prices that are reasonable. And so I think that's what a market craft of the future needs to look like.
Okay, and I'll put it just this addendum on that last question, which is: are you finding people open to this? Are there people you're talking
Yeah.
to? Are there organizations that you think
Yeah.
that this is not you crying in the wilderness, but the beginning of some sort of movement?
Yeah. Yeah. Movement might be a bit
Yeah.
aspirational, but there's certainly a lot of curiosity and I think a real commitment to thinking in a fresh, new way. I think we saw this we can see this in the culture in a lot of different places. And I feel that as I talk about these issues. So,
Very good.
yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terrence.
Yeah, Chris, keep up your good work.
I really appreciate it.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Talk to you soon. Have a good one.
Thank you.
I'm back. And as I mentioned at the top, I'm going to read a speech that I gave June 9th, 1989, 36 years ago, at my 20th college reunion, Harvard class of 1969. Now, in 1989, I was fully involved in the entertainment industry. As an actor, I was a recurring character on the nighttime soap Knots Landing, and a film that I'd co-written and co-produced and actually produced some of the music for, and written some of the songs. Earth Girls Are Easy was actually playing at the Harvard Square Theater that week. In the speech, I asked whether we were living up to our youthful ideals, and I've often said I'm not sure whether it affected anyone else, but I came back home and got much more involved in causes, setting me on the path, really, on which I found this show 7 years later. So here goes. Thank you for this opportunity. This is my first reunion. I'm glad to be here. I spent the last couple of years at Harvard and the first couple afterwards teaching and counseling chronic schizophrenics and Boston area school kids from Lincoln to Roxbury. And at some point I decided to leave that work because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life creatively responding to people's problems. Looking back now, I realize that's all we can ever hope to do. For an independent study in 1969 on Marshall McLuhan, I wrote a paper in which I put forth the notion that the entertainment and image industries might be our only hope, referring to the establishment as the system. I called us the revolution, and I felt there was no way we could ever compete with them on their terms, and perhaps we could outcreate them. Samuel Goldwyn said some years ago, if you want to send a message, use Western Union. Preston Sturgis, self-questioning director in Sullivan's Travels, eventually learns that laughter is a worthy contribution, and much of what I've created is comedy, some of it satire, and I try to do all my work, whatever the material, in front of or behind the camera, with some essence of quality, which I hope communicates itself. But I now found myself committed, really, to an industry which I feel is the prime culprit in our society's addiction to distraction. I could recite for you a lot of Harper's Index facts and figures about things like the greenhouse effect and depletion of the ozone layer. The bottom line for me is that our species, and perhaps the entire life force, seems to be committing gradual global suicide. Their sense is constantly barraged by stimuli, by messages, images, facts, excuses, temptations. People are numbed. In the classic addictive model, they distract themselves to deny their experience and their condition. Politics, education, religion, or the arts might once have equipped us to deal with our current moral, social, environmental crisis. But USA Today, Entertainment Tonight, Action News, tabloids, sound bites intentionally trivialize, sensationalize, and package our best impulses. The last presidential election campaign seemed more a long-running TV show. than an actual referendum on the leaders and policies of this powerful nation. For years in entertainment, there have been, in essence, two industries. There are the actual products, plays, films, radio, television. There's also a side industry which consists of personalities, gossip, trivia, scandal. Now, as media replaces community, everything is show business. Attention is focused more on the celebrity than on the beliefs or actions of public figures. As a global tribe, I believe we have some very serious work to do. I want to use this moment to share with you a vision that I've seldom been able to fit into my music videos, movie scripts, or characters I play on primetime TV. I had been off campus teaching the day of the takeover of University Hall in '69. When I arrived in the yard and heard what had happened, there was no question in my mind what I would do. Although I hadn't had a hand in removing the deans, I immediately went inside to stand with those who did. I slept that night under a table on one of the upper floors, and just before dawn, the buzz went through the building that they were coming. We all massed down in the central room on the main floor and waited. I tied my long hair back, got a bandana ready to protect me from tear gas, and joined arms with those around me. The campus press actually ran a photo of me taken at about that moment, and I looked scared shitless. The police arrived in their powder blue uniforms with jodhpurs, high black boots, and shiny helmets. I knew we were engaged in civil disobedience. I assumed we would go limp and let ourselves be arrested and let out. I'll never forget looking over my shoulder as the rear doors opened and troopers came in swinging 3-foot-long billy clubs. I'll never forget the screams of my fellow students or the sounds of those clubs smashing heads. Turning away, I saw that it was possible to get out of that room, into an office, and jump a floor and a half to the ground. I jumped. I've thought often over the years about that choice, what it meant that I was there and that I jumped rather than get beaten for what I believed. But today, the central truth of our situation is there's no window for us to jump out of. I think we're in a unique moment in human history, in the history of this planet. It seems we have until recently been able to move in a constant progression of growth and acceleration. The only limits might be the limits of human imagination. The truth we must now face is that we live on a physically finite planet. Our production and consumption of goods is outstripping the Earth's ability to replenish our resources or absorb our waste. Our place in the universe has changed. There have been other such moments, the discoveries of Galileo and Copernicus, for example, but we cannot afford the luxury of years of resistance before gradual acceptance of the new truth. Another event unique to this time is a positive one. Spurred on by the threat of nuclear destruction and by the emergence of instant communications in global markets, we are now seeing an end to the Cold War. We face not merely an immense crisis, but also an immense opportunity. Never before has it been as necessary to look at life in the long term, and yet I think never before have we shared as short a view. In the past, when the extended family seemed to have more permanence and more resonance, when we were less mobile, when neighborhoods and towns seemed to last, even when the captains of industry dominated whole industries with family-owned companies, I suspect that our culture took a longer view. Now the locus of decision-making, where values come from, is no longer in family or religion or in nature. Values seem now to come from business. Our whole society seems infected with the kind of thinking born of an overpowering fixation on short-term profits, quarterly dividends, year-end statements. There is lag time between the changes in our actions and the corresponding changes in the global environment, but we cannot wait to find out the exact ramifications of the greenhouse effect or of ozone depletion. Based on the possibility and probabilities of catastrophe, we have got to begin now to change the way we think, the way we make decisions, the way we live. As Soviets and Chinese move to adopt market capitalism, we see the emergence of a single global economic model. Free enterprise has proven to be the most successful mechanism for harnessing human energy toward innovation and productivity, and yet there is something terribly wrong. Not with the concept of capitalism, but with our bookkeeping. The true costs of goods and products, the environmental cost, the social cost, the cost and quality of life, are nowhere reflected in current economics. Only when real costs are taken into account will the market impulse truly serve us and our planet. We also need to value true productivity and reverse the pervasive trend to reward speculation and money manipulation out of all proportion to the human benefits they create. We can no longer act as adversary nations or adversary alliances. We cannot look at the immense debt of poorer nations as their problem. The U.S. practice of restricting the distribution of environmentally unsafe or toxic substances within our borders and then freely dumping these same goods in other markets can no longer be tolerated. We are all in this together. I imagine it sounds as if I'm focused primarily on environmental issues. And I must admit that is the perspective that most calls for the radical shifts in culture that I feel are essential to our survival. Yet the same solutions, long-term thinking, accurate cost accounting, are just as necessary to deal with our deteriorating infrastructure, healthcare systems, the emergence of permanent urban underclass, drugs, AIDS, you name it. When we take the long view, our priorities change. Security is no longer national security, but rather global security. And security is no longer solely military. Education, preventive and prenatal health care, research, energy conservation emerge as top priorities. So-called primitive peoples of our land knew that we do not inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children. Last night at the buffet in the tent in Radcliffe Yard, there were alumni from perhaps 1919 to 1989. And late in the evening, I looked up and found that everyone had left except the 4 tables of the class of '69. And that showed me that our shared experiences forged a bond between us that still exists. We were part of a unique moment, not just at Harvard, but also in American history. Our contribution has been minimized by revisionists, but we and others like us caused the U.S. to resign from a war that was wrong, and we forced a criminal president to resign from office. We had 3 basic virtues that empowered us to act as we did. We had faith and hope. There was purpose to our actions. We believed we could actually achieve things that had never before been possible. We believed we could change the world. And we had love. As angry and passionate as we were, we also acted out of love for the innocents on both sides who were dying in Vietnam, for the poor and the minorities in this country, for ourselves, and for ideals that we felt were being shamed and ignored. We need these same virtues now. One reason people don't face what's happening is that they lack the faith or the hope that we can save ourselves. I think a lot of people secretly believe we're already doomed. So they cocoon themselves around their home computers and their VCRs, blind to the environmental crisis and the explosive inequities of our society. We must again generate the faith and the hope and the love of our children and our grandchildren, of our planet and of life itself. It will take that energy to begin to direct our own evolution, to shift our culture and our values, and ultimately to save ourselves. People have asked me which environmental area I'm most concerned about: endangered species, greenhouse gases, toxic wastes. I answer the area of human consciousness. It is in our culture and in our values that the greatest change must take place. I don't yet have a lot of specific suggestions on how to do that. I believe, however, that such change is an absolute necessity and that it is going to take the best minds of our generation in the service of deep passion and dedication. I want to challenge our class, myself included. Do we have it in us to take this on? I don't want to seem glib, but I don't believe we can depend on those 10 years older or those 10 years younger to lead us. I am confident, however, that we can challenge those 10 years older and we can inspire those 10 years younger. We've done it before. And I ask, if not us, then who? And if not now, when? Let us come together again in 5 years and in 20 and 25 and know that we have done everything in our power to leave the world better than we found it. Thank you.
The Progressive Voices audience has grown to nearly 1 million regular listeners. Unfortunately, so have our operational costs. We feel it's important to protect the very limited commercial nature of the stream, so to keep up with these costs, we need your financial help. If you want to continue enjoying great shows like Randy Rhoads, Stephanie Miller, Tom Hartman, Leslie Marshall, and so many others on the free mobile Progressive Voices platform, please go to progressivevoices.com and press the donate button right now. Thank you.